What if I told you that behind the headlines, beyond the politics, and buried beneath the silence of powerful institutions, there lies a reality so brutal, so undeniable, that even scientists are shocked, yet afraid to speak? What if the truth you're about to hear has been hidden not because it lacks evidence, but because it challenges the comfort of the status quo? Today, we're going to pull back the curtain. We're not just talking about politics, we're talking about lives lost, homes demolished, children buried, and a nation accused of crimes that go far beyond the battlefield. This is not a conspiracy. This is not exaggeration. This is well documented, deeply human, and painfully real. Or speak Buddhistically. So I ask you, don't just listen. Feel it. Question it. Stand witness to it, because by the end of this speech, you won't just understand why so many people call Israel a criminal state. You'll understand why silence in moments like this is the loudest betrayal of all. Stay with me. This truth demands to be heard. The accusation that Israel has committed human rights violations is a central element in the discourse that labels it a criminal state by many observers, analysts, and rights-based organizations. These violations span a wide range of actions, including military operations, systemic discrimination, occupation policies, and treatment of detainees. This critique is not simply political rhetoric. Rather, it is often backed by evidence collected and published by well-established international organizations, including Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, United Nations agencies, and various humanitarian NGOs operating in the region. The documentation over decades has painted a pattern of policies and actions that many believe systematically violate international human rights law, humanitarian law, and even basic ethical standards. One of the most prominent areas of concern is Israel's policy of occupation and control over Palestinian territories, particularly the West Bank and Gaza Strip. Since the 1967 Six-Day War, Israel has maintained a military occupation over the West Bank, and while it disengaged from Gaza in 2005, it continues to control its borders, airspace, maritime access, and even population registry. The result is a situation where millions of Palestinians live under conditions that human rights groups describe as a form of apartheid. Due to the dual legal systems in operation, one for Jewish settlers and one for Palestinians. This two-tiered system of governance often results in systemic discrimination, including but not limited to movement restrictions, land seizures, and denial of building permits to Palestinians while facilitating settlement expansions for Israelis. A particularly controversial aspect of Israeli policy has been the use of administrative detention. Administrative detention allows Israel to detain individuals, including minors, without charge or trial, often for renewable 6-month periods. This practice is widely condemned as a violation of basic rights to due process. International human rights law permits administrative detention only in exceptional cases, such as an imminent security threat. But Israel is accused of using it routinely. Many detainees are held based on secret evidence that neither they nor their lawyers are allowed to see, which further strips them of the ability to mount a defense. The psychological and emotional toll of this form of imprisonment, especially when applied to children, is deeply concerning and has prompted condemnation from UNICEF and other child welfare organizations. The treatment of Palestinian children under Israeli military law is another aspect frequently cited as a human rights violation. Unlike Israeli children, who are subject to civil courts, Palestinian children in the occupied territories are tried in military courts, often for minor offenses like stone throwing. According to Defense for Children International Palestine and other monitoring groups, children are often arrested during night raids, blindfolded, handcuffed, and interrogated without the presence of a parent or lawyer. Reports of physical and psychological abuse during detention are numerous. This treatment stands in stark contrast to Israel's obligations under the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, to which it is a signatory. Such disparities in legal treatment based solely on ethnicity or nationality represent systemic discrimination, which is a core concern in human rights law. Freedom of movement for Palestinians is heavily restricted through a complex system of checkpoints, roadblocks, and the Israeli-built separation barrier, often referred to as the apartheid wall by critics. The wall, which cuts deep into the West Bank in many areas, was ruled illegal by the International Court of Justice in 2004. Israel argues that it is a necessary security measure, but critics point out that its route frequently benefits Israeli settlements while cutting off Palestinians from their agricultural lands, schools, medical care, and jobs. The daily humiliation, delays, and denial of basic freedoms of movement contribute to a sense of collective punishment. This undermines any possibility of economic growth or social development for the Palestinian population, and is viewed as a breach of Article 13 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which guarantees the right to freedom of movement and residence within the borders of each state. Housing demolitions are another deeply controversial aspect of Israeli policy. The Israeli government regularly demolishes Palestinian homes in East Jerusalem and Area C of the West Bank, often citing the lack of proper building permits. However, obtaining these permits is nearly impossible for Palestinians due to systemic planning discrimination. These demolitions often occur without sufficient warning and result in the displacement of families, including children. According to the UN Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs, OCHA, thousands of Palestinians have been displaced by such demolitions over the past decade. The policy is widely viewed as a form of forced displacement, prohibited under international law, and considered a war crime in occupied territories under the Fourth Geneva Convention. In Gaza, the situation is even more dire. The territory has been subjected to a blockade by Israel since 2007, which severely restricts the movement of people and goods. The blockade has been described as a form of collective punishment by the UN and various humanitarian organizations. It has had a catastrophic impact on Gaza's economy, healthcare system, and general living conditions. Over 80% of Gaza's population relies on humanitarian aid, and basic necessities like clean water, electricity, and medical supplies are often in short supply. The repeated military assaults on Gaza, notably in 2008-9, Operation Cast Lead, 2012-2014, Operation Protective Edge, and in subsequent escalations, have resulted in thousands of civilian deaths and injuries. The use of high-impact weapons in densely populated civilian areas has raised serious concerns about violations of the laws of war, particularly the principles of distinction and proportionality. Humanitarian organizations have also documented the use of live ammunition against unarmed protesters. One notable case is the 2018 Great March of Return in Gaza, during which thousands of Palestinians protested along the border fence, demanding the right of return and an end to the blockade. Israeli snipers reportedly shot hundreds of unarmed demonstrators, including medics, journalists, and children. Human Rights Watch and the UN Human Rights Council found that in many cases, Israeli forces used lethal force in situations where it was not justified under international human rights law, which only allows such force when there is an imminent threat to life. In addition to physical violence, there are also violations related to freedom of expression and assembly. Palestinians and even Israeli activists who speak out against occupation policies often face harassment, arrest, and restrictions. Palestinian journalists and human rights defenders are often targeted, and NGOs working in the occupied territories have been labeled as terrorist organizations by Israel, without sufficient evidence, according to international observers. This undermines civil society and silences voices critical of state policy, creating a climate of fear and repression that is antithetical to democratic norms and international standards of free speech. International human rights law imposes specific obligations on occupying powers, including the requirement to protect the civilian population and not alter the demographic makeup of the territory. Yet, the expansion of settlements, the treatment of detainees, the destruction of homes, and the restriction of basic freedoms all point toward a long-standing pattern of violations. These actions not only deepen the suffering of Palestinians, but also entrench a system of inequality that has been compared to apartheid by prominent organizations. In 2022, Amnesty International released a landmark report labeling Israel's policies as constituting apartheid under international law, citing systematic oppression and domination of one racial or ethnic group over another. The international response to these violations has been uneven. While UN bodies have repeatedly condemned Israeli policies and actions, enforcement mechanisms are weak due to geopolitical realities. The United States, a close ally of Israel, frequently uses its veto power at the UN Security Council to shield Israel from sanctions or binding resolutions. This imbalance in accountability contributes to the perception that Israel operates with impunity, reinforcing the narrative of a criminal state in the eyes of many observers. The lack of meaningful consequences for well-documented violations of international law creates a dangerous precedent, not only for Palestinians, but for the international legal order as a whole. These patterns of abuse are not isolated or accidental. They represent a consistent application of state policy aimed at maintaining control over a population without granting them equal rights or autonomy. This structural oppression, backed by military force, legal systems, and administrative mechanisms, is why many legal scholars, human rights advocates, and even some Israeli voices argue that Israel is engaging in practices that constitute crimes under international law. The label of criminal state is thus not merely a slogan, but for many it is the culmination of decades of observed, documented, and lived realities. One of the most pressing and tragic aspects of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is the repeated military bombardments of the Gaza Strip, which have resulted in extensive civilian casualties and destruction. These military operations, often justified by the Israeli government as acts of self-defense against rocket fire from Palestinian factions such as Hamas and Islamic Jihad, have led to the deaths of thousands of innocent men, women, and children. The loss of life has led to the deaths of thousands of innocent men, women, and children. Human rights organizations, journalists, and eyewitnesses have documented numerous incidents in which civilian infrastructure, including homes, schools, hospitals, and UN shelters, have been bombed or shelled by Israeli forces, raising serious concerns about the proportionality and legality of these actions under international humanitarian law. Gaza is one of the most densely populated areas in the world, with over 2 million people living in an area of just 365 square kilometers. This extreme population density means that any military operation in the region carries an inherently high risk of civilian casualties. Despite this, the Israeli military has launched multiple large-scale operations in Gaza over the years, including Operation Cast Lead in 2008-9. Operation Pillar Defense in 2012, Operation Protective Edge in 2014, and more recent escalations in 2021 and 2023. Each of these operations has resulted in a heavy toll on the civilian population, with thousands of lives lost and tens of thousands more injured or displaced. In many cases, entire families have been wiped out in a single airstrike. During Operation Cast Lead, for instance, the Israeli military conducted over 2,300 airstrikes and fired thousands of artillery shells into Gaza over the course of 22 days. According to the Palestinian Center for Human Rights and other independent monitors, over 1,400 Palestinians were killed, including more than 300 children and 100 women. The Israeli human rights group Tselem reported that many of those killed were civilians who were not participating in hostilities. Schools, mosques, police stations, residential buildings, and even UN-run shelters were targeted or struck, sometimes by mistake, other times as part of broader attacks on areas allegedly used by militants. Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International documented the use of white phosphorus munitions in densely populated areas, which can cause severe burns and uncontrollable fires, and whose use in such environments is considered a violation of the laws of war. Operation Protective Edge in 2014 was even more devastating. The Israeli assault, which lasted for 51 days, resulted in the deaths of over 2,200 Palestinians, of whom approximately 1,500 were civilians, including over 550 children, according to UN estimates. Entire neighborhoods such as Shajalia and Quzar were leveled by airstrikes and artillery bombardment. The destruction was so extensive that in some areas it resembled scenes from a natural disaster, with homes reduced to rubble and infrastructure completely destroyed. Israeli forces also struck several UN schools being used as shelters for displaced civilians, leading to high-profile international condemnation. The UN Independent Commission of Inquiry on the 2014 Gaza conflict found that Israel may have committed war crimes, particularly in its use of force against civilians and in its failure to distinguish between military and civilian targets. One of the most controversial practices used during these operations is the so-called roof-knocking technique, in which the Israeli military drops a small, non-explosive device or fires a warning shot onto the roof of a building before launching a full-scale attack. While Israel claims this is a humanitarian measure to warn civilians, human rights organizations have criticized the tactic as insufficient and dangerous. In many cases, people were not able to evacuate in time, particularly the elderly, children, or the disabled. There have been documented instances where just minutes separated the warning from the lethal strike, not allowing enough time for safe evacuation. In other cases, the buildings were bombed without any warning at all. Civilian casualties are not just a result of physical attacks, but also of the collapse of essential services due to the bombardments. Hospitals have been hit directly or rendered inoperative due to damage to surrounding infrastructure. Ambulances have been struck while attempting to evacuate the wounded. Electricity and water supplies are often cut off, and sanitation systems are destroyed, increasing the risk of disease and worsening humanitarian conditions. Now, Jessica, thanks for the banner you throw out for me today. My ambulances have been struck while worse than the targeting of power plants, water treatment facilities, and other vital civilian infrastructure has been condemned by humanitarian organizations, who argue that these actions violate international norms that prohibit attacks on objects indispensable to the survival of the civilian population. The trauma inflicted on Gaza's civilian population by these repeated bombardments is immense. Entire generations of children have grown up knowing nothing but war, displacement, and loss. Psychological studies conducted by NGOs and UN agencies in Gaza show extremely high levels of post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, anxiety, and depression among children and adults alike. Many children have lost parents, siblings, and friends in airstrikes, and some have been maimed for life. With medical resources already scarce due to the Israeli blockade, long-term care for the wounded and traumatized is often unavailable or inadequate. The Israeli justification for these assaults is typically framed around the need to protect its own civilians from rocket fire launched by militant groups in Gaza. It is true that rockets fired into Israeli territory do pose a security threat and have resulted in casualties, although the number of Israeli civilian deaths is much lower due to the effectiveness of the Iron Dome missile defense system and civil defense protocols. However, critics argue that Israel's response to these threats is massively disproportionate and often indistinguishable from collective punishment. Under international law, particularly the Fourth Geneva Convention, collective punishment is strictly prohibited. Furthermore, Israel has been accused of intentionally targeting civilian areas to apply pressure on the civilian population of Gaza, under the theory that this would erode support for Hamas. This strategy is deeply controversial and widely condemned. Targeting or punishing civilians for the actions of a governing entity or militant group is a clear violation of the principles of distinction and proportionality, which are cornerstones of international humanitarian law. These principles require parties to a conflict to distinguish between combatants and civilians, and to ensure that any attack is proportionate to the military advantage gained. International reactions to these bombardments have often been inconsistent. While some governments and institutions have condemned specific attacks or called for investigations, there is rarely any real accountability. The International Criminal Court has opened preliminary investigations into possible war crimes committed by both Israeli forces and Palestinian armed groups. But political pressure, particularly from powerful allies of Israel, such as the United States, has made the path to justice extremely slow and uncertain. As a result, many Palestinians and their supporters see a pattern of impunity that encourages further violence and suffering. The failure to prevent or punish these repeated atrocities has fueled resentment, radicalization, and hopelessness among Palestinians, especially in Gaza. Every round of conflict leaves deeper wounds, destroys more homes, and further erodes the prospects for peace. The bombardment of Gaza and the resulting civilian casualties are not merely unfortunate byproducts of conflict. For many observers, they represent deliberate and systematic actions that violate the laws of war and human rights norms. These events, documented in detail by multiple independent observers, are a core reason why Israel is often accused of being a criminal state by those who seek accountability and justice for the victims. In conclusion, the reason many people around the world call Israel a criminal state is rooted in decades of documented human rights abuses, systemic oppression, and repeated violations of international law, particularly in the occupied Palestinian territories. From illegal settlements and forced evictions to military bombardments that kill innocent civilians, including children, the evidence is overwhelming and deeply disturbing. Despite global shock and outcry, many scientists, academics, and even politicians remain silent, either due to political pressure, fear of backlash, or calculated indifference. But silence in the face of injustice is complicity. Speaking truth to power is not a crime. It is a moral responsibility. The lives lost, the families shattered, and the generations traumatized demand more than our sympathy. They deserve justice, accountability, and the collective courage to call out crimes, no matter who commits them. Thank you for listening with an open mind and heart. May your voice always stand firm on the side of justice, no matter how loud the silence around you may be. Good luck as you speak truth in a world that often prefers comfort over conscience. Stay brave, stay informed, and thank you once again for choosing to stand with humanity.